What's going on, everybody? It's Odin coming back with a video, and today we've got the box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the release and premiere of Steven Spielberg slash Disney slash 20th Century Studios' much anticipated remake, reboot, whatever it is you want to call it, of Westside Story. That classic tale from, the 60s that everyone and their mother was asking to be remade by modern-day Hollywood, which of course we know is not true. And to very little surprise, the movie only made $10.5 million in its grand opening, and at a $100 million budget, it is in some pretty deep financial trouble and waters at this early time. Before going, though, any further into these numbers, please make sure you smash that like button, and also make sure you're subscribed to the channel with the bell notification turned on. That way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. So, West Side Story, 20th Century Studios, one of the many holdovers from the 20th Century Fox deal with Disney, right? So a lot of these films were in production, different types or different times of their production when Disney bought out 20th Century Fox and to redub it 20th Century Studios. And so when it comes to actual financial loss for this and for other films, it really is kind of hard to really gauge it, because much of the money that was spent on production was already spent by 20th Century Fox at the time of the deal. And as far as marketing is concerned, I guess one could argue that the marketing side of things would have to have been taken over by Disney, or at least Disney money being involved in some form or fashion. With all that being said, though, it is very clear that this is a movie, regardless of who's going to be losing money, that is not going to be making the money that it took to make this movie back in any way or capacity. It's very hard, I think, for anyone at this point to really say that this film has really any chance of being able to break even, by the very fact that it barely beat out Encanto. And Encanto has not had an incredibly strong release either, though, to its credit, it did have a pretty strong hold in its third week of release, dropping only about 28%, which is a pretty strong hold and indicates relatively strong legs. Unfortunately, of course, the film opened to such a low amount in comparison to many other films of its variety that it is not looking like it'll cross the $100 million mark domestically, and will not make enough internationally to make its money back. With that being said, though, when you have a film like Encanto making just a little bit less than West Side Story, that in its first week of release, that is not a very good sign for the Disney Spielberg production. Going into the top three, though, Ghostbusters Afterlife is continuing to strongly hold as well, similar to Encanto, with a 31% holdover, and this in its fourth week of release. The film is at $112 million domestically and is inching ever closer to its break-even point. Definitely seems to be about a week or two away from being able to reach that mark based on the numbers, so it is adding money on every single week. Obviously, that amount is going to be continuing to drop off as the weeks go on. The one thing that it does has a bit of a light, and I guess this could be true of both, not just Ghostbusters Afterlife, but also even Encanto and some of the others, is that you have the holiday movie season coming up. And even though it's going to be absolutely dominated by Spider-Man, because that is just going to be the biggest release of this year, there's just no doubt about that in anyone's mind at this point, it still also indicates that people and audiences that are more drawn to stories like Encanto or like Ghostbusters Afterlife are going to have a little bit more extra time and maybe even a little bit of extra cash, depending on whether they get any type of AMC gift card or gift cards in general, etc., to be able to actually go out and see some of these movies. And so I suspect that that will probably end up helping out the long run for some of these films. However, the issue is that when it comes to Ghostbusters Afterlife, it is getting pretty close to its break-even number, whereas with films like Encanto or House of Gucci, it is incredibly far away from its break-even number. Rounding out the top five, though, is Disney's Eternals, which, though we see strong holds in the domestic marketplace, $161 million being its domestic total, this is so still far away from the end result of Black Widow, and also it was, of course, more successful internationally than the other films, but is not coming anywhere close to the number made by not just Black Widow, but also films like Shang-Chi as well. Diving into these numbers a bit more, West Side Story in its entire worldwide debut brought in a whopping $14.9 million. And some people might say, well, this is an Oscar bait type film. It was only released in about 2,800 screens, so what'd you expect? I would agree had the film not cost $100 million to make. because when you have a $100 million price tag, and that's not even counting marketing, that means that this film's break-even point is in the $200 million range. And that is a very big problem when you have an Oscar bait type film, which are notorious for not making a lot of money at the box office. Typically the more modern day Oscar bait type film are those independent films that cost a lot less to make. And this seems to be kind of the exception to it, where even though it might have that indie feel, even though it might have that low budget feel to it, they still spent $100 million. I don't know where in the world that $100 million was actually spent on the film, but somehow, some way, they were able to find a way to actually put that much money into the actual film itself, and so it's not looking very good for it. Encanto right now worldwide, $151.8 million. Again, just not performing well domestically or in any of the international markets, so it's just not going to be able to make up the amount of money that it needs to break even. Ghostbusters Afterlife is now at $164.5 million worldwide, again, inching ever closer. Seems likely that it will break even at some point in the next couple weeks. House of Gucci, which had a very weak start, also another massive $100 million or so budget film, or at least a very high budget film for the kind of movie that it is. Another one from Ridley Scott that looks like it also is on pace to lose money, though because of its stronger holds and because of its budgets and other things going on with the film, it actually does still have a chance to make a little bit more money, especially over the holiday season, especially with some positive word of mouth. And this would go for Ghostbusters Afterlife. Also, some positive word of mouth has come from Encanto and even West Side Story as well. But will it be enough to push these films over the edge or not? It's really hard to say, because when you have strong holds from week on to week on, if you had a very strong, large opening weekend, that is a very good sign. But when you have a very low opening, like in the case of West Side Story, where you're only making about $10 million, when the original estimates had the film making anywhere from $13 to $15 million in its opening, you're starting to realize that even if it has a strong hold from week 1 to week 2, and it's going to definitely not be as strong because of the fact that Spider-Man is going to be, again, saturating the market next weekend, it is something that needs to be discussed nonetheless. Eternals, around $395 million worldwide, and again, this movie just does not seem to be anywhere close to, again, needs to make $500 million or so to break even, and so this film has only added just a few, like about $5 to $7 million in the last week, all together worldwide. So it is not in a good position. It is not in a strong position to be able to make its money back. Diving into the actual charts, that's right, I do some box office charting over at ombreviews.com. As you can see, West Side Story at $14.9 million. We'll have a full breakdown of the film next weekend when we get those week 2 estimates. But because of the $100 million budget, it means that the film's cost with marketing, typical marketing cost, is around $150 million, meaning the break even, again, under the assumption that, as most studios do, get about 60% of the entire box office totals. The break even for this film then would be around $250 million. The fact that opening weekend it's at only $14 million means that this film is just not in a good position to ever reach the $250 million mark. It is still pretty early on, so for all we know, it could open up in a lot of other foreign countries that could end up being really strong for it, but it just does not seem like that is going to actually happen. Right now, it's looking at a $141 million loss, and I'll be able to have some projections on the long-term range and the long-term forecast for it next week once we actually have those week 2 drop-offs. All the while, you're looking at other films like House of Gucci, which, though it is now up to $30 million in total, is around, again, a $41 million loss at this point in time. So obviously, that's something that I need to update there. I believe I did update. Maybe it just needs to be refreshed just a little bit more. There it is. So yeah, House of Gucci with $93 million in the total box office is a $56 million loss. So again, getting a pretty strong hold right now. Just a few weeks in, it's at about 72%. So again, most films make somewhere between 50 and 70% of their entire box office within their first 2 weeks. So this number here is what the first 2 weeks are in comparison to what the current total is. So it's about to break into that 70s or into that 60s range, which means that you could see this film getting a little bit closer. However, even if it does break into that average range, you're still looking at a film that likely will end up somewhere around a $30 to $40 million loss, even if it does have strong legs because of how little it made in its opening weekend. Encanto, right, is around 76%. And as you can see that this film is right now at an $88 million loss, as this film cost a fair amount of money to make, $120 million budget, and there are some estimates that it cost upwards of $150 million, so it actually could be even higher than that. Break even for this film is around $300 million, so as you can see, this film is definitely in a lot of financial trouble, as it's just not making much money anywhere. Ghostbusters Afterlife, as I said, is getting very close. Again, right now it's at negative $13 million with $164.5 million. Its break-even number is $187.5, which I think is completely doable, especially as we enter into the holiday season. So this is a film that is definitely getting close to that break-even point, and could definitely, at this point, argue that 4K and Blu-ray sales could make up for it. I know a lot of people have been following Dune and are big fans of and really wanting to see Dune succeed. As I mentioned, when it comes to the box office, there really just is no argument at this point that Dune did lose money at the box office. However, because the box office loss is as low as it is, around $13 million or so, it does indicate that 4K, Blu-ray sales, things like that, will likely in the long run make the film profitable enough to justify its sequel. The one thing I will say is that, and if anyone's a fan of the Dune film by Denis Villeneuve, as I myself am a fan of that movie, despite the story just not really connecting from the original book, what I will say is that this should be concerning for the sequel, only because what this means is that they did not make a lot of money off of this film, if any at all. In the long run, they might make a little bit of extra cash off of this film, but it's not a major blockbuster hit by any means whatsoever. That is going to indicate not just the fact, obviously, we know that it's been confirmed to have a sequel, but it could have an impact on how much money they actually put into that sequel. And as we all know, if you look to the first Dune film, we saw just how well done the visual effects were and just how well done everything looked, and that requires a certain amount of money. And even though Denis Villeneuve is able to work with little money to produce some pretty impressive results, if he gets even less money for his sequel, which is likely going to be a lot bigger and a lot more stuff going on, and therefore requiring a higher budget, but he doesn't get it because of the fact that the first film just didn't make really any money at the box office, and if anything, arguably made just a little bit of profit in those extra sales post-theatrical release, that, of course, is reason to be concerned. But the big news, of course, is West Side Story looking to be yet another massive financial flop for, obviously, Disney. But obviously, I just want to remind everybody that because this is a part of the 20th Century Studios, 20th Century Fox deal, the question of how much money is actually being lost by Disney versus being lost by 20th Century Fox is kind of really a little bit up in the air at this point in time. So if I find more information about that, I, of course, will bring that to everyone's attention. But what are your thoughts? Do you think West Side Story is going to surprise everybody and somehow be able to reach the massive $250 million break-even point that it needs to make? Let me know in the comment section below, or anything else that I talked about in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash that like button. It really does mean a lot. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.